Well, I have 5 things for you today. Oh, there they are. Thank you. 5 things that I've learned, 5 patterns from studying the work of Richard Saul Wurman. I bring you these patterns from Michigan, where I live and work. I have the good fortune to teach a class in information architecture at the School of Information at the University of Michigan. And finding answers to my students' questions about what is the architecture part of information architecture made it necessary for me to understand the work of Richard Saul Wurman. As Jesse said, Wurman coined the phrase in the 70s, and so I had to do this. And it's been a fascinating study. I've spent about 5 years doing this. Getting used to the gadgetry here. Oh, great. Wurman is not famous outside of maybe a room like this. Wurman isn't famous for having invented information architecture. If people know his name, they think of him as the inventor of the TED conference. And what's weird about that is the things that most people know and admire about TED are things that happened when Chris Anderson purchased the conference from Wurman back in 2001. If you look at some of the videos from TED when Mr. Wurman ran it, it's peculiar. In some of the videos, the camera will be positioned in such a way where you can see that Mr. Wurman is sitting on stage during the talks. And Brenda told me that when she spoke at TED, this is what happened to her. He sat on the stage during the talks, and then if the talk became tedious or was going off the rails or something, he would get up off of his chair and escort you off the stage. And because everything that he does is for himself. It wasn't for the audience. And so he's famous for inventing this wonderful TED conference, but the things that you like it for are not the things that he did.
They're on about 60 subjects. I've done them on sports. I've done 6 on medicine, a couple on business, Wall Street Journal, Guide to Money and Markets. They're on all different subjects. At the same time, they're all on one subject. A passion to find a pattern. A passion to take the journey from not knowing to knowing.
That's the reason why he invented TED. That's the reason why he does everything, is his passion for taking a journey from not knowing to knowing, to understanding for himself. And so my intent in starting this research was to identify, well, what are Wurman's teachings about information architecture? And then I'll take whatever those are and I'll give those to my students, and that'll be great. But what I found pretty quickly goes well beyond information architecture, beyond the design of user experiences. What I found is that he has a way of life, a way of approaching work where he can make things be good. 83 books, countless publications and conferences and buildings and maps that he's made. My methodology has been to look at this stuff and to try to figure out what are the patterns behind it. How does he make things be good? And so the way that I've been working on this has been more opportunistic than smart, maybe. Because I have this day job of working as an information architect, I have to work this research into the rest of my time. And so rather than working chronologically backward, or working chronologically from where he started and then going forward, it's been easier for me to work backward from the more recent stuff. All of his books are out of print. And so my methodology has been, well, I'm just going to find as many of the artifacts that he's created as possible, and I will examine them and try to deduce patterns from these. And so by about the time that I hit, I was working backwards on the timeline, and by the time that I hit 1989 with information anxiety, I had already figured out, or I thought I figured out, what these 5 patterns were. They just were leaping out at me the further I was getting into this man's work. And just last year, I finally acquired a copy of Mr. Wurman's very first book that he made with his students in North Carolina when he was teaching architecture in 1963. And I was delighted and a little relieved to find that at 26 years old with this very first book, all 5 of these patterns are just vivid in this very first publication. He's 78 now, and he's still doing things. And the things that he is making today are vivid with these 5 patterns. This is a project that he launched a month ago. It's called Urban Observatory, and you should check this out. The patterns are all over this thing. And then on Tuesday, he launched an iPad app, and the patterns are there too. So 5 patterns over 50 years of this man's work. Would you like to know what these patterns are? Okay, well, I will tell you what they are. The shorthand that I use for the first pattern is hats. And in this pattern, hats are an analogy for pieces of information. And hat racks are analogous to ways and structures for organizing information. Wurman contends that the choices we make in arranging the hats and selecting the hat racks affects much more than usability or findability. The choices around organization affect meaning. He says the creative organization of information creates new information. Changes in the organization of information changes the meaning of what we're working on and with. The information doesn't change. So whether it's hats or dogs, however you want to work this metaphor, the hats, the dogs, the information doesn't change, but when we change the way that it's organized, the meaning changes. Another way to put words on this pattern would be to say that order encodes meaning. And if we look at what Starbucks is doing here, this way of organizing the website, this is a different place. This means different stuff than if they gave me a crack at this and I did something they ought to do, which is to collapse the menu and the coffee sections into a thing. That would be a different place. They've got a store tacked on. Shopping should be throughout the site. So there are all these changes, the same information. If we were to reorganize this information, this would be a different place. It would mean differently. So that's the easiest pattern, is hats. Order encodes meaning. Next pattern, shorthand for this, you could say sand castles. And in 1970, Mr. Wurman's firm in Philadelphia had a client. They actually had 4 clients who had put together the money to buy a piece of beachfront on Long Beach Island in New Jersey, which is about an hour and a half from Manhattan. And this is the architecture that Mr. Wurman created for them. They're called sand castles, and sadly, 3 out of 4 of them have gone the way that all sand castles go. And this is what they built where 3 of them used to stand. This is what most of the vacation homes on Long Beach Island look like. And so how do we account for the significant differences between sand castles and whatever this is? For an answer, we can look at Mr. Wurman's work from 1976. In 1976, he was chairman of the American Institute of Architects, and the national conference was in Philadelphia, his hometown. And rather than having a keynote speech, he decided they ought to have a keynote fable. And he wrote a fable called What If Could Be, a historical fable of the future. And in this fable, the main character in the fable is a little fat guy with a beard who goes around saying things that make people uncomfortable. Which is a thinly veiled, that's Mr. Wurman. That's pretty much what he does. And what he says, what he notes to the inhabitants of What If in the land of Could Be, is that the problems in the architecture of the built environment, this is an architecture conference, so Commissioner of Curiosity and Imagination is going around looking at the built environment, sees these problems, and he says, you know what? The problems in the architectures of the built environment are due to problems in the architectures of information and language, which must have been odd for architects to hear. The Commissioner of Curiosity asks a teacher, well, what's wrong with education? And what the teacher says, well, we need more books, we need more classrooms, we need more pencils. He asks a policeman about crime. What are these problems with crime all about? Well, if we had more jail cells, more cops on the beat, more bullets and bulletproof vests. The reason the inhabitants of the city of What If in the land of Could Be can't have nice things, according to the commissioner, it's because they don't have the right language to describe their needs. All they have are the words more and no. So back to whatever this is. You can make this using the words more and no. If you drive up and down Long Beach Island, you can grab the roof deck from a place down the street. You can see these little eyelid windows a little further away. That barn-like garage door thing, they borrowed that from a neighbor. More and no. That's how it normally works. But to make a building like this, to make a sandcastle, you need a different approach. In the book Information Anxiety, Wurman says the classic pervasive seduction to designers has been to find a solution instead of the truth. And how easy is it just to go around and say, well, what do you like? Pick out the windows, the doors, the things, and we'll make it. What was true for these 4 families, what good would mean for them, was a couch facing the sea. That's where these buildings come from, is that language, couch facing the sea. With Wurman's assistance as their architect, they found a way to describe the essence of what they wanted before talking about how they would do it. The pattern of sandcastles is putting what before how. The pattern of whatever the new building is amalgamate a bunch of hows. Google Wave was an amalgamation of a bunch of hows. But what was the what of Google Wave? I don't know, and I think that's why it failed. The teaching here is that you can make things be good by learning how to develop your what in advance of, and maybe even without regard to the eventual how. Another way Wurman puts words on this pattern is that understanding precedes action. And if we're talking about how we're going to do things, the act of making, before we've gotten systematic with what, we're not going to make things be good the way that he makes things be good. Next pattern. Shorthand for this one, you could say gathering. This is the stage and the set and the furniture that Mr. Wurman designed for last year's www.www conference. Does anybody attend this conference? Yeah, me neither. I would have liked to. It was in Redlands, California. The iPad app that I showed you a screenshot of that launched on Tuesday. All of the conversations from this conference are available on that app, so you should go check that out. Conferences for Wurman aren't primarily about the talks, although that's important. They're about the action of the verb to gather. That's what he's doing when he makes a conference. He calls it a gathering, and the action of the verb to gather has a specific methodology underneath it for him, for this gathering and staging a gathering. The principle underneath this pattern is that you only understand something relative to something you already understand. And so when you gather the unknowns and the knowns and gather them together. Gather up the unknowns in a manner that affords comparison with the knowns, and then use adjacency and the power of comparison to enable your understanding. The 10-cent word, oh, did I go back? I did, sorry. The 10-cent word for this pattern is apperception, and I may even be pronouncing it wrong. Apperception is the learning process and it's a learning process that's structured on the basis of adjacencies and comparison. The genius of TED isn't the 18-minute talk. The genius of TED, when Wurman curated and ran it, is gathering a motley crew of technologists, entertainers, and designers, and then learning from and delighting in the adjacencies and the contrasts. The talks are important, but the contrast between the talks are just as important and sometimes create more meaning than the talks themselves. So gathering and apperception. Almost through the patterns. This pattern, shorthand for this one, is tango. And you may not be surprised based on what I've told you or what you've heard about Mr. Wurman that he is both of the partners in the dance. The dance in this pattern is a tango between his terror and his confidence. Wurman uses the energy that's generated in the interplay of terror and confidence as an engine to get where and what he wants. In 1959, for example, he had the confidence to bluff his way into the first archaeological expedition in Tikal, Guatemala, and then had to deal with the terror of being exposed as having lied about knowing how to operate the cartographic and surveying equipment. But they weren't going to fly him back, so he just learned how. He wanted to go, harnesses this engine of terror and confidence to make it happen. The way that this pattern works is pretty simple. So he has yet another conference coming up called 555. And the way that you use this pattern is you announce an ambitious project without having worked out any of the how you're going to do it. And then you have to pull it off to avoid the embarrassment of, and the humiliation is his word, of not making good on your boast. So this combination of terror and confidence is a propulsion system underneath 50 years of this man's work, which sounds kind of dumb, right? I mean, really? That's it? Yeah. And that is the final pattern, is dumb. This may be the most iconic piece of work Mr. Wurman has created. This is a map of the Tokyo transit system. And it isn't actually in the shape of an yin and a yang. But by being dumb and asking what would be the simplest, just that everybody would get in this culture for what needed to happen here, the way that he made this is by being dumb, not by being smart, not by being an expert. The sense of dumb isn't stupid dumb, it's innocence dumb. And the anti-pattern to this pattern is expertise. When we develop expertise, we lose innocence. We lose the ability to understand what it's like to not understand. We're caught up in being smart, and that makes it difficult or impossible to access the vantage point of innocence, where there aren't any preconceptions. Mr. Wurman learned this pattern from his teacher, Lou Kahn. Wurman said of Kahn, "He was the youngest person I ever knew." That's what I aspire to be, the youngest person I possibly can, so I can look at things like I have never seen them before, and see the things I've always seen, yet never seen. That's the only doorway I know about, that innocent doorway of clarity. Elsewhere, he says, "The only thing I have a grasp of is my inability to understand, and that's why I'm more powerful than people who are smarter than me." Dumb is the ultimate pattern in 50 years of Mr. Wurman's work. Expertise expires. Expertise gets in the way. Expertise has a shelf life, and it limits your repertoire. What if the JCPenney guy had come in and said, "Yeah, you know that I rocked it out for retail for Apple, but I don't understand JCPenney. Why don't you come with me on a journey from not knowing to knowing, and we'll understand what would be good to do here?" That isn't how you have the worst quarter in retail history. We worship expertise, and that is why Mr. Wurman is more powerful than people are smarter than him, is he embraces his ignorance. One of the dumbest good things that Mr. Wurman has made is this road atlas from 1990, where the maps are arranged spatially in 250-mile blocks that you can drive kind of in a day. This is the only road atlas in the history of mankind that is not arranged in alphabetical order. Because who drives on roads in alphabetical order? But you have to strip away preconceptions. You have to, no cartographic expert, no expert in atlases would ever have come to this, because it's too dumb. Wurman got to this solution by being innocent dumb, via that innocent door of clarity, by stripping away all of the hows that everybody else has done and sort of getting at, well, what's my what here? So 5 patterns for making things be good and not for the good of humanity. It's for the good of doing good work. He does not care about us. He cares about doing good work for himself. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share these patterns with you today. I'd love to hear from you if you're terrified or confident enough to try them out in your own work. But if learning and applying 5 things is too much, start with dumb. Try to understand what it's like to not understand. Don't lead with your expertise. Try leading with your ignorance, with what you don't know. And one might think that after spending 5 years poring over this guy's work, that I'd be able to demonstrate some proficiency with this pattern. Nope. The most important pattern turns out to be my own Achilles heel in trying to realize something out of this work that I've done. I became an expert in the work of Richard Saul Wurman. And this expertise has gotten in the way of me making something good out of all this research. A couple weeks ago, I went to Newport to pitch Mr. Wurman on two things. My what, which is these 5 patterns, and then a how, which is an approach that I'd cooked up for making a book and a box and all sorts of crazy things. And he talked with me for 6 hours, and he blew up my how. The how I pitched him on was a $250,000 Kickstarter project to produce 3,000 box sets. Libraries don't have his work. I own more of his work than he does. All these books are out of print. So in my expertise, all hopped up on my how, I pitched him on this $250,000 Kickstarter project to produce 3,000 box sets containing exact facsimile recreations, replicas, poster-sized blow-ups of the baddest of the badassery that he's made over this half-century of work, and a monograph in there to map all the precious things to the patterns. And each one of these boxes would have to cost like $100 or more to produce. They'd have to sell for $250 or more. And it was a precious, perseverative, expert approach where I was going to fetishize over all of Mr. Wurman's marvelous implementations, recreating these die-cut pop-out diagrams and sourcing the same inks and papers and things. I got all hopped up on my how. And Mr. Wurman, with a graciousness that I will never forget, I might cry, he showed me the error in my approach. He appreciated the work that I put into this, but he said it wasn't good because it's not dumb. It was all about my expertise. He validated my what, so I gave you that today, but he blew up my how. So now I'm back to square one. And I've been asked to complete something good, something dumb, in time for his 80th birthday, which is, there's a clock here and there's another clock now. So in March of 2015, I hope to be publishing something really dumb about all of this. So thank you.